Future time narrative and prophetic sequence. In the last module, we looked at the past time narrative sequence. Now we're going to look at the other narrative sequence in Hebrew, which here we're calling the future time narrative sequence. So let's look at our chart. The past time narrative sequence, if you remember, is carried forward by the preterite plus the vav consecutive. And sometimes it'll be started off by a perfect. Often not, though. Often it'll just start with a preterite. The future time narrative sequence is the perfect plus vav consecutive, and it will often be started by an imperfect or some other verb form that sets it in the future, or at least non-perfect form. And I think this linkage here is more common than this one. More often, the perfect plus vav consecutive will in fact start with an imperfect, then the preterite starting with a perfect. This one, at least my sense is that the preterite plus vav consecutive can start by itself without this. But this here, the perfect plus vav consecutive, more typically actually is preceded by an imperfect or some other non-perfective verb. I could be wrong on that, but that's my sense. Anyway, let us look at an example, a couple of examples here of the future time narrative sequence. So let's read this first. Yisrefu et ha'ir v'lachedu et ha'am. So saraf here, which is our root, means to burn. And yisrefu, we see a prefix here, so we know we have an imperfect form. And this is the 3MP, yisrefu. They, and we'll translate this as a future, at least to begin with. They will burn et ha'ir, the city. V'lachedu. Now, what is this verb here? We see we have a lamed here. This is lachad. Lachad is to capture. And we have our vav, and then we have straight off here the root here. Lamed is our first letter in the root. So there's no prefix. So we know we're dealing with a perfect form. And so v'lachadu, if we didn't have this vav here, lachadu would be the 3CP form of the perfect, and we'd simply translate it probably as they captured in the past. But given that we have a vav here, and it is preceded by an imperfect, let us translate this as the future time narrative sequence as a future. Okay? They will burn the city, and they will capture the people. Now, let us try and translate this as a past. Remember, this guy here, this vav, we cannot tell whether it is a vav consecutive or a vav conjunctive just by looking at it. Because with the perfect, they both look the same. They both look like this. With the preterite, remember we have the special form. We have this one here. So with the preterite, we can distinguish vav consecutive from vav conjunctive because we have this special three-part vav consecutive with the preterite. But with the perfect, we don't have this option. Let me get rid of this here. They both look the same. So how do you know? Well, you know from context. Let's try this in the past. They will burn the city, and they captured the people. Now, does that make any sense? They will burn the city, future, something they're going to do sometime in the future, and they captured the people. Well, which people are they capturing? The ones that belong to the city they will burn? That doesn't make sense. You can't do the capturing of the people before you do the burning of the city. So it's largely context that will tell you this. Now, I think typically, in my limited experience so far in reading Hebrew, if I encounter a perfect with a vav, I'm not sure which way it goes. If before it there is an imperfect or some other verb that says in the future, typically this will follow that. The perfect plus vav will follow whatever that imperfect is, which tells you that you're dealing with a vav consecutive. Now, when you're reading, you don't encounter this first. You encounter this first, right? So your mind is already in the future. They will burn the city, and it just naturally follows. and capture the people. So it doesn't actually throw you as much as you may think, because you encounter the future first, and then you encounter this. Now we are calling this the future time narrative sequence. That is not as accurate, I suppose, a designation as we could use. We could call it, probably more accurately, the non-perfective narrative sequence. And let me show you what I mean by that. We know from the last chapter, the one on the imperfect, that we can translate an imperfect in more as more than just a future. Future was one of our options. We also talked about it's sort of a non-temporal habitual. The Lord judges the righteous, I think was our example. There, what we mean is the Lord judges the righteous all the time, anytime, past, present, future. We could also use the imperfect to indicate customary past action, and typically we would translate that with used to or would. Something that happened in the past as a habit or a custom. And thirdly, there was the whole section of modal uses of the imperfect. He would, he should, could, ought to, obligation, wish, desire, whatever. These non-indicative uses. They're not making statements. They're talking about desires, wishes, obligations, something like that. Now, if in these sequences we need to, let's say, translate the imperfect as one of these non-future options that we have, then the perfect plus vav consecutive will follow and be translated the same way. It's consecutive. It carries forward whatever tense we are, or whatever meaning we're giving to the imperfect. The perfect plus vav consecutive will carry that forward. So let's change our sentence here a little bit. Let's say this is he'arim. So cities. He'arim rather than city. And remember, this is our article. It goes to a segol because we have a guttural here, and I don't know exactly anymore. Is it guttural with the comments under it? You can go back and take a look at all the rules for how to change your article before gutturals. But anyway, suffice it to say here that we know that this is still our article. It's a little different here than here. It's a segol rather than a comments because of this guttural. And it's in the future. Or sorry, plural. Singular, plural. So if we were to change this to the plural, maybe we could say, they used to, so translating the imperfect as a customary past action, they used to burn the cities. They used to burn the cities and capture the people. If we translate this as a customary past, they used to burn the cities, then we want to translate this also as a customary past, and they used to capture the people. It was their habit. It was something they did. It was their custom. They burned and they captured. My point here is really two things. One is that the perfect plus vav consecutive will take the basic tense from what precedes it. If this is future, this will be future. If this is customary past, if it needs to be that from the context, then this needs to be translated as a customary past. So that's the first thing. This will follow this. The second thing is that really this is more than just a future time narrative sequence. Or it's a future time narrative sequence if you take future in the very broadest sense of what future means. It's really more than a future. But for the purposes of first year Hebrew and not getting too confusing and adding all kinds of grammatical terms, past time narrative sequence and future time narrative sequence is a good way to start to think about it. And often, in fact, it will be literally this will literally be the future, and then this will need to be future as well. Just recognize that there are other options as well, and that this, the perfect plus vav consecutive, will follow whatever is preceding it here. Okay, let's look at another example. Yilkod oto v'saraf oto. So again, we have our same two verbs here, lachad to capture, and saraf to burn. Now this is what form? Lachad with a prefix. So we're dealing with an imperfect, right? So imperfect. So let's say, let's translate that as a future. He will capture, אותו, it, וסרף. So now we're dealing with a perfect, right? There's no prefix here. We have vav, and we have straight off here, saraf, nothing in between there. So this is our perfect. Now, is it plus vav consecutive or vav conjunctive? Well, if you have an imperfect before it, more than likely this will be vav consecutive. So we have he will capture it and he will burn it. Or simply, he will capture it and burn it. So if this is future, you'll translate this as future. If we need to translate this as something else, as a customary, then we would translate this that way as well. Okay, this is simply another example. Now let's look at our last example here. This one is a little bit different. Shema Yisrael. Now this is the great Shema statement from Deuteronomy 6, verse 4 to 5, I think it is, 4 to 5. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. That would all go in here. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Now what we have here, Shema, this is an imperative. We haven't come across imperatives yet. Imperatives are commands. We'll come across that in chapter 20. So it won't be too long before we do that, but here you have a little taste of what's coming. So here we have an imperative. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And then we have v'ahavta. Ahav is to love, and this here is a perfect. Right? We don't have any prefix here, and we've got our vav, and then we have our verb with a ta ending. So this is 2ms. It's perfect. Cal perfect 2ms plus, well, let's try this vav consecutive here. So what happens here is that even though you don't have an imperfect here, this perfect plus vav consecutive will carry forth the same tense as you had over here, tense in a loose sense. So this was an imperative, so we'll have this as an imperative. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you shall love. So it's kind of future, but it's also really an imperative, right? He's saying you shall love. Sometimes in English, especially as parents, we'll talk to our children this way. You will do this. We're not really we're not really talking about the future. We're really using the future to talk about a command that we want to give them. You will do this, or else, And that's kind of what's going on here. So we have this preterite, or this perfect, plus vav consecutive, that is kind of a future, but really it's got this command sense to it, because it's following from this one here. We have an imperative, and so this is going to have this imperative sense to it as well. So this is an example where we have a future time, a so-called future time narrative sequence over here, that is preceded by something other than the imperfect, in this case the imperative. The second thing I want to point out here is that the way you would pronounce this is v'ahavta. I put these two little dots up here because if you look at the Masoretic text, you'll notice that they have their cantillation mark or their accent mark sitting here. Now, if you memorized your perfect paradigm and you did it correctly with the right stress, you would know that this is ahavta. Normally this is ahavta, stress is here. But the way you pronounce this, the way the Masoretes are telling us, is that this should be pronounced v'ahavta. I think I mentioned before that you can get an accent shift with the v'katalti, or with the, Vikatalti is another name for this. I'll talk about that in a later module. But the perfect plus vav consecutive sometimes has an accent shift. And here's an example. The accent shifts towards the end, and we see this in two forms, the 2ms and the 1cs. Those are the only places where you'll see it, and it isn't always there. So you can't always expect it, but if you do see it, then you know that you have a vav consecutive. Okay? V'ahavta. It's a small thing, but it can be helpful to indicate that this is a vav consecutive and not just a vav conjunctive, meaning and. I'll have a module on accent shift to lay that out a little bit more clearly, but we already see it here. So future time narrative sequence, it is perfect plus vav consecutive, and it is preceded by some sort of future type verb, or at least non-perfective verb, and the perfect plus vav consecutive will carry forth whatever basic translation value we're using for the non-perfective verb that precedes it.